to have you here this morning. We're going to do something a little different. Usually we take June, July, and August off, but we're going to do something a little different here in June. And that is, I'm going to share something that I've shared with a number of different pastors at different luncheons. A number of months ago, Doug Schmidt, who used to be the pastor at Woodside, asked me if I would do some luncheons with him on pastoral soul care. And so I did, and we did about 5 different luncheons, and then he asked if I would record it. And so we're going to record that today. And so if you're a pastor, this is specifically for you, but if you are a man who leads ministry of some kind, this is for you as well. Or if you're just a man who's wanting to grow in your relationship with Christ so that you can be more effective for Christ as a man in this world on his behalf, this is here for you as well. But how we're going to present it today is how I originally presented it to the different groups of pastors that I met with across the metro area here. And so with that in mind, figure out where you fit in, and then adjust what I say for your purposes. And I think this will be something that will be beneficial for us all, okay? So here we go. I want to begin with an assumption, and that assumption is this: being a pastor or being in any kind of ministry is an extremely difficult calling with high demands and expectations. If your ministry, does that make sense to you? Do you understand that? You've experienced that. That there's people looking to you, and there's a lot of demands, there's a lot of expectations when it comes to serving God's people in ministry. So being a pastor is an extremely difficult calling with high demands and expectations. Now see if you can follow me with this next part of it. Undergirded by a nagging fear, I won't get it right. Have you felt that fear? Have you experienced that? You got these expectations, people looking at you, waiting for you to get it done, and everybody's wondering, are you going to get it right? And it's blessed with someone always there to remind you when you don't. Do you have that person's face in mind? My guys, after I graduated from seminary, I was a senior pastor for 10 years at a church just outside of Ann Arbor. And that guy for me was Willis. Willis lived just a little ways from the church, had a green fluorescent barn. And Willis sold the land to the church. And so Willis was not only close to the church, but Willis kind of felt he owned the church because it was on his former land. And so whenever I would do anything, Willis was always there to remind me when I didn't get it right. Now, if you have been in a position like that, if you have a Willis in your life when it comes to being a pastor or in ministry, you know that this chronic ministry fear of always being exposed as inadequate will take a toll on every aspect of your life. That first 10 years of ministry, it did that for me. Physically, it did. Emotionally, relationally, and spiritually. It took a toll on every aspect of my life. And if you're a pastor, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, with that assumption, I'd like to begin by asking this question. What is the current state of your soul? Just think about that for a second. What is the current state of your soul? As you think about that, what's the first thing that came to your mind? Maybe it was, I'm not really sure what you mean. Or maybe it was, I've never really considered the state of my soul. That's new to me. Or maybe you're sitting there saying, well, are you using the Greek or Hebrew definition of soul when you're asking that question? Maybe the first thing that came to your mind was, I wouldn't know how to assess that question. Maybe you're sitting here thinking, the state of my soul, that's something I'd really rather not think about. Not someplace I'd really want to go to. Or maybe you're sitting here saying, well, pretty good, I guess. What's the first thing that came to your mind when we asked that question? What is the current state of your soul? Now, maybe if you can't give an answer, maybe we can kind of help you come up with an answer by looking at the current state of the average American pastor's soul. And we can maybe get an idea what that is if we look at some of the statistics. For example, 80% of pastors today say that they are discouraged. 75% say that they're extremely stressed. 71% say that they're depressed. 91 report being burnt out to the point that they just feel fragile. 55% say they feel trapped in ministry. If there was a way to get out of it, they would, but they see no way out of it. 40% report having a significant conflict, monthly conflict, with someone in their church. 72% report that they do not regularly seek God. 70% say they have no close friends. And if you don't have any close friends, you're probably going to have a poor marriage because you're going to be looking for something from your wife that she can't give you. So 77% say they have a poor marriage. And if you have a poor marriage, it shouldn't surprise you that 63% say that they have sexual compulsions, sexual struggles. 37% say that they've had or are currently having a sexual affair with someone within their church. 1,700 pastors leave the ministry monthly. And 10% retire as a pastor. That means if there are 100 pastors in this room out of seminary, by the time they're ready to retire, only 10 would remain in ministry. What do these statistics reveal to us about the average American pastor? Well, what it reveals is that most pastors, the state of their soul is not very good. Parker Palmer says this. He says, a pastor must take special responsibility for what's going on inside of himself or herself, lest the act of leadership create more harm than good. I think that's true. Put another way, what's going on in the backstage of your private life will always show up on the front stage of your public life. For example, how many of you have heard the podcast, The Fall of Mars Hill? It's put out by Christianity Today. If you haven't heard it or listened to it, it's well worth the time. It's about maybe 10, 12 episodes, all on the church Mars Hill in Seattle, Mark Driscoll, and what happened there. But if you haven't heard of that one, maybe you've heard of Willow Creek. They could have easily done a podcast on the fall of Willow Creek, or even the fall of Harvest Bible Fellowship. Now, what do these three churches have in common? Mars Hill, Willow Creek, and Harvest Bible Fellowship. Well, they're all big mega churches. They're all very successful. They are very influential in not only America, but across the world. They are leadership driven, and they have become a model for doing church for many different churches. I remember when I was on staff at Grace Community Church, every year we would have to go to Willow Creek for a leadership conference. And maybe you've done that too. Now, these churches were pastored by very charismatic pastors. Mark Driscoll, Mars Hill, Bill Hybels, Willow Creek, and James McDonald, Harvest Bible Fellowship. But what do these three pastors have in common? Besides at one time being very successful and influential? Well, all three left in disgrace, and all three brought terrible harm to their church and the honor of Jesus Christ. And the question is, why? What happened? Well, what I'd like to suggest is that the reason all this came about is because they operated from a front stage only ministry model. Personally, if you listen to their lives, if you look at their lives, what they did and what they continued to do for a period of time could not have been happening if they were dealing with the backstage. It only happens when you neglect the backstage. But not only did they personally operate from a front stage only model for doing ministry, but the whole church as an organization functioned from a front stage only model of ministry. And the reason they did is because they were big, successful, influential churches that had a product to give, and in order to keep that product going, they had to have the star, the pastor, continue. So how do you keep that doing? You overlook the things that are going on in the back, not going on in the backstage, and you ignore the things that are not good going on in the front stage. And as a result, the church, these three churches, ended up becoming far less influential than they were in the past. And they're still struggling to come back together. Mars Hill, I think, is even no longer exists. So there's a lesson for us to heed in this, and that's this. Doing ministry on a front stage focus where everyone sees, while neglecting the backstage where no one sees, is a recipe for ministry disaster. Why? One reason. It regards a front stage only, disregards the nature of ministry itself. You say, well, what's the nature of ministry? The nature of ministry is two-dimensional. First, what one is in relationship to God. Second, in the service of others. That's a basic definition for ministry. Who you are in relationship to God in the service of others. Notice, who you are in relationship to God, what's that? Backstage. In the service of others, what's that? Front stage. We see this in Jesus' restoration of Peter to ministry in John 21. Remember, Peter was the one that said, even though everyone else is going to deny you, I won't. And a couple hours later, Peter is denying Jesus to a little girl 3 times. And so Peter has blown it. He's been unfaithful to Jesus in ministry. And so what's Jesus going to do with Peter? Well, Peter soon finds out at a breakfast that he has with Jesus on the beach of the shore of Galilee, Sea of Galilee. Remember, he takes Peter aside and he asks Peter a question. And what is the question Peter is asked by Jesus? Peter, do you love me? 3 times. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And each time it's followed up with the statement, what? Then feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Notice, Peter, do you love me? What's that? Backstage. Who Peter is in relationship to God. Then Peter, feed my sheep. What's that? Front stage. Notice, Jesus' call to Peter is to himself first, not to ministry. In other words, ministry is the overflow of Peter's relationship with Jesus. And guys, ministry of any kind will always be the overflow of our relationship with Jesus and our relationship to God. You and I are not called to ministry. We're called to God. We're called to Jesus to follow him. And out of that comes our ministry. And ministry has nothing to do with where we get our paycheck. It has to do with what's going on inside of us and what's going on outside of us as it's being shaped and formed by a relationship with God. Now, what all this means for us is this. The nature of ministry demands that we turn from a front stage only model of ministry and we turn towards a back to front stage ministry model. What we're being told today is if you are going to be successful in the church, you have to have a front stage only model. And what we see from the scripture is no, that's a recipe for disaster, that if you are going to be successful in ministry, you have to have a back to front stage ministry model. For example, what does Paul tell Pastor Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:16? He says this to Timothy, Timothy, keep close watch on yourself. What's that? Backstage. And then he says, and then on your teaching. What's that? Front stage. He says, persist in this. And what's the this he's to persist in? A back to front stage model of ministry. And for by doing so, you will save both yourself and your hearers. I would suggest that is a successful definition of ministry. Remember what Jesus says to the leaders of his day, ministry leaders of his day, the scribes and the Pharisees? He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. What? For you clean the outside of the cup and dish. What's that? That's the front stage. He says, but you neglect the inside, which is full of greed and self-indulgence. What's that? That's the backstage. And then Jesus says this, first wash the inside of the cup and dish. What's that? Backstage. And then what? And then the outside will become clean too. And what's that? Front stage. In other words, notice what Jesus is saying here. He's saying that because the backstage always informs the front stage, a back to front stage ministry model is imperative for our lives. Here's another way to look at it. The two-dimensional nature of ministry, front stage, backstage. Notice the backstage is your private life as a pastor, as a ministry leader, as a man. Front stage is your public life as a pastor, ministry leader, as a man. The backstage is who I am. The front stage has to do with what I do. The backstage, who I am, is I am first and foremost a lamb. Humble, needy, small lamb. The front stage, what I do is I shepherd. I care for people. I lead people. I guide people. Notice, if a pastor forgets that he is first a lamb before he is a shepherd, he will always be a dangerous shepherd. We are first a lamb before we are ever a shepherd. And as a lamb, backstage, who are we shepherded by? We're shepherded by Jesus himself. Front stage, as a shepherd, we are a servant of Jesus. Backstage, as we're shepherded by Jesus, what is he doing in us? Well, he's forming in us personal character. As a servant of Jesus, we use the leadership skills and abilities that he gives to us. Now, what I want you to see, guys, is this, that the backstage always informs the front stage. What's going on in your backstage, good or bad, will always show up, good or bad, sooner or later on the front stage. That's just the way it is. Why? Backstage will always inform your front stage. Now, let's look at a pastor who's attentive to his backstage. A pastor who's attentive to his backstage will be abiding in Jesus, John 15. He will be yoked with Jesus, Matthew 11. He will be loyal to Jesus, John 14. He will be fixed on Jesus, Hebrews 12:2. And as he is abiding, yoked, loyal, and fixed on Jesus, he will lead from what I call a fullness expression pattern of relating. There will be a fullness in him that he receives from Jesus, and out of that fullness he gives to others in ministry. Why is that? Because when you're abiding in Jesus, you're living a fruitful life. When you're yoked with Jesus, you have a refreshed soul. When you're loyal to Jesus, you have a contented heart. And when you're fixed on Jesus, you have transcendent steadfastness. And by what I mean by that, guys, is that your steadfastness will always be there, whether in good times or bad times. It goes beyond circumstance. And when I'm leading from that fullness expression, what will happen is I will be operating out of God's larger story, in which I see myself as a pastor, not as the main character, but as a supporting character in God's plot. What he is doing in the world, in me, through me, in his church, and through his church. And when I'm operating and you're operating out of that larger story as a supporting character, what we see then is we will be pastors or ministry leaders who feed Christ's sheep, as Peter learned to do in John 21. Now, let's contrast all this with a pastor who neglects the backstage, a ministry leader, a man who neglects his backstage. What will that look like? Well, he won't be abiding in Jesus, John 15. He won't be yoked with Jesus, Matthew 11. He won't be loyal to Jesus, John 14. And he won't have his eyes fixed on Jesus, Hebrews 12. And as a result, he will not lead from a fullness expression pattern, but he will relate from an emptiness pursuit pattern. There's nothing inside him, so he has to fill it, and he goes around wherever he can, and he fills it. Why? Because when you're not abiding in Jesus, John 15 says you'll have a barren life. When you're not yoked to Jesus, Matthew 11 says you'll have a weary soul. When you're not loyal to Jesus, you'll have a discontented heart, and when we're not fixed on Jesus, you'll have circumstantial steadfastness. You'll be good as long as things are going good, but when things go bad, you won't know what to do. And as a result of that emptiness pursuit pattern, you won't be operating out of God's larger story. You'll be operating out of your own smaller story where you are the main character. And the plot of your story will now be, I got to fill this emptiness. And when that's the plot of your story and that's what you're operating out of and you're a pastor or ministry leader, rather than feeding Christ's sheep, guess what you'll be doing? You'll be using ministry for our own ends and own purposes. And tragically, a lot of times, we're not even aware that we're doing it. So what I want you to see, guys, is this. The backstage, what's going on in the backstage, will regulate the condition of your soul so that as a result, what goes on in the front stage will be a reflection of the state of your soul. And what I want to talk about today is the care of our souls. How is it that we give attention? How is it that we come to attend to our souls as pastors, as ministry leaders, as men? So my thesis is this. Because the state of our soul shapes the spiritual quality of both our life and ministry, it's imperative that we make tending to our souls the top priority of our life and of our ministry. A lot of things that are important, but what I'm saying is the most important thing is tending to our souls, because if we get that wrong, then everything else will be informed by that. Or, as Curly put it, the one thing that informs everything. So, our purpose today is to show you how you can tend to your soul by using 3 types of spiritual practices. Okay? 3 types of spiritual practices. The first one is what we're going to call slowing, which is the door to the backstage. Before you can even deal with the backstage, you got to get into it. Slowing is the door to the backstage. The second practice is self-awareness. Self-awareness involves sitting in the backstage. So the door opens through slowing. Self-awareness involves sitting. And the third practice is what we're going to call surrender, which is the work of the backstage. You do more than just sit in the backstage. There's work to be done in the backstage. Okay? So slowing, self-awareness, and surrender. And these are not things that, okay, if I do this, and now I'm done. It's slowing, self-awareness, surrender. It's like an oscillating fan. You're going back and forth instead of something that's just a linear thing. Okay? So you practice slowing, you practice sitting, you practice surrendering, you practice slowing, you practice surrendering, you practice sitting. It goes back and forth all through your entire life. A book that can be helpful for this, it's called Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. It's probably about maybe $15-20. It's well worth the price. Adlai Calhoun, you can get it on Amazon. So let's go then. The first practice is the practice of slowing, the door to your backstage. I want to begin by making an observation. Maybe you can identify with this. Most pastors, most ministry leaders, most men are unable to tend to their soul because they can't access their backstage. I want to tend to my soul, but I can't get to the backstage. The question is, why can't we get to the backstage? Why can't we gain access to the backstage? Well, I think the reason is because the backstage is a place of listening, noticing, and pondering that requires a still and quiet soul. Now, what's the problem with this? The problem with this, the problem with you, the problem with me, the problem with ministry, the problem with our culture is what? Most of us don't have a still and quiet soul because we are too busy living life and doing ministry at a hurried and fast and busy pace. Would you agree? So why is that? Why is that? Well, 3 reasons when it comes to, I think, pastors. First of all, busyness is an unspoken expectation in a pastor's job description. It's written there in the job description, every pastor's job description. And for that matter, most men's job description, there's this expectation written into it that this is going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and there's going to be a lot of expectations that's going to require you to hurry, faster, do more, try harder. There's a film that just came out, What is a Woman? Anybody see that? Matt Walsh? Oh, that is well worth the watch. Well worth the watch. But I want to ask the question, what is a pastor? What is a pastor? Here's my informed definition of being a pastor and working with many pastors through the years. A pastor is someone who has learned to say over and over, again and again, until he dies, honey, I promise things will slow down after this week. Some of you guys are laughing. Maybe that's something you've said to your wife. Honey, I promise things will slow down after this week. And she's there looking kind of angry, as you see. But what she doesn't know is the thought bubble that's in that man's head. And you know what the thought bubble is in that man's head? He's seeing a picture. And the picture is of himself sitting across the desk or the table from his board or from his staff or from his boss. And they're looking at him with all these expectations that have to get done. And so when he says, honey, I promise things will slow down after this week, what he's really saying is, I can't slow down because if I do, I won't get done what's expected of me and I'll lose my job. So honey, things will get slowed down after this week. I promise. But he just makes that promise over and over again and again until he dies. What's the problem with this expectation? That you cannot slow down because if you do, there's something wrong with you. Well, first of all, it denies three biblical realities. First, every pastor is human, right? Second, every human is limited. And third, the spiritual life is about becoming fully human, not superhuman. Guys, whether you're a pastor, a ministry leader, or just a man living in this world, God is shaping you and forming you into a fully human man, not a superhuman man. Now, what does a fully human pastor or ministry leader or man look like? Well, I would suggest that he's a man who is joyfully serving others for the sake of Christ within the clear confines of his own human limitations without guilt or without shame. Three important things I want you to see here. First of all, he's joyfully serving Christ. I don't know about you, but so often it's easy to serve Christ out of duty and just out of a sense of obligation and with a sense of anger. People never appreciate what I do. They don't tell me that they appreciate me. I never get any encouragement. And so we serve Christ, but not joyfully. A pastor, a man who is serving Christ, who is fully human, is able to serve with a sense of joy. Second, he also knows his clear confines of his own limitations. He knows who he is and he knows who he's not. He knows the limits of his body, and the older you get, the more limited you become in your body. He knows the limits of his time, he knows the limits of his energy, he knows the limits of his ability, and he knows the limits of his responsibility, what I'm responsible for and what that person is responsible for. And he serves in these clear confines without guilt or shame. He doesn't feel, well, I'm not doing it, but I should be. And I hope they don't see that I'm not doing this. Maybe I got to explain why I'm not doing this. He does it with joy, not with guilt or shame. And when we refuse to live within our own human limits, guys, it does three things. Number one, it dishonors God. Number two, it depletes your soul. And number three, it denies access and it prevents access to your backstage. Why? Because the door to your backstage requires that we slow down. It's some wise words from great theologians or sassy sages. First one, a man's got to know his limitations. There is so much truth to that. I think that's in a television evangelist that said that one, isn't it? Yeah. Another one is, God is the one who never sleeps. I am not. I like this one. Just because the devil never slows down doesn't mean I should take my clues from that loser. So, slowing is the door to the backstage. And the first reason I think we have a hard time slowing down is because a lot of times it's just kind of the unspoken expectation of our job descriptions. Second, busyness is baked into a front stage only ministry model. It's baked into a front stage only ministry model. It was baked into Mars Hill's ministry model, to Willow Creek, to Harvest Bible Fellowship. And maybe it's baked into yours. I don't know. You see, you don't have to be a mega church to have a front stage only ministry model. It doesn't matter how big or how small your church is. Doing ministry from a front stage only model will always produce a church culture, a church climate, a way of doing ministry that is filled with busyness, striving, and hurry. Why? Because a front stage model of ministry is primarily focused on three things. First, what we have. Second, what we do. And third, how we look. For example, what we have is about acquiring. We got to get bigger and better, bigger and better, bigger and better, acquire more. Second, what we do is about accomplishing. We're going to go faster and further, get down the road, faster and further, faster and further. Third is about how we look, is about admiration. We got to be excellent, and we got to have all the new innovations. So people will look at us and they will say, we want to be like that church. Now, when you're all about acquiring, accomplishing, and admiration, there is a message you're sending to your staff, to your board, to your elders, to your deacons, to your church. And you know what the message is? The message is this. Get excited, get on board, get busy, get ready. Why? Because we're going somewhere. We're not really sure where we're going, but we're going somewhere. I don't know about you, but when it comes to church, I've got some pet peeves. And one of my pet peeves is announcements. And the one pet peeve I have when it comes to announcements is I always listen for the word excited. Hi, we're excited today that you're here. Why? Because we're excited about what we're doing. Why? I always count the number of times the person doing excited uses the word some form of excitement. I'm not kidding. One time I heard that word used in 5 minutes of announcements 27 times. 27 times. You know what the message is? Get excited with us, get on board, get ready, get busy, because we're going somewhere and we want you to be part of it. Now, when that's your message, what happens to the pastor, to the staff, to the elders, to the volunteers, to the ministry leaders, to the church? Sooner or later, everybody gets exhausted because you can't slow down. Sooner or later, when you're exhausted, you begin to become angry, cynical. Why we always got to do this? And then you begin to feel guilty. Oh, I shouldn't be feeling angry. This is for Jesus. And then there's some people who just don't care, and now we're angry, and so then you have everybody else coming around and they're shaming them. Come on, get back on board. This is for Jesus. You're not thinking of others. And when you're exhausted and there's anger and guilt and shame, what does that do for a staff? What does that do for a board? What does that do for a ministry? What does that do to the volunteers, to the church? It creates division. Being busy and hurrying doesn't produce a successful ministry. Princeton Theological Seminary did a study maybe 10 years ago, and you can find it in Psychology Today. But they had 3 groups of pastoral students that they assigned to travel across the campus to preach a message on the Good Samaritan. In other words, they were here, here's your assignment, go over on the other side of campus, over here, and preach this message on the Good Samaritan. Now, they divided them into 3 groups. The first group was told that you could take your time and when you left and how long it took you to get there because you were going to get there and it was going to be early. Okay? The second group were told that you have to leave now if you're going to arrive on time. So get going. And the third group was told that you need to leave right now. You should have left 20 minutes ago. And so you're going to really need to hurry to make it on time so that you can give the message to those people there on the Good Samaritan. So they take off. But what they didn't know, to get to their destination, they had to go through this small alley in which the school, the people doing this study, hired an actor, and they put him in the middle of the alley, and he was to pretend that he was sick and in need of help. So, here is the guy laying there in the middle of the alley as these three groups are passing through with him lying there on their way to preach a sermon on what? The Good Samaritan. So what happens? Well, 63% of the first group stop. They got time. They can help this guy out. What happens to the second group? 45% stop. Well, not as many can stop because they're just going to get there just in time. What do you think the third group? Third group, they're going to be late already, so the third group, 10% stop. As they're on their way, they step over them. There's a guy there on their way to talk about the Good Samaritan. What does this study reveal? Well, a number of different things, but the thing I want us to see is this. Busyness and hurry are being baked into the ministry model that's coming out of the seminaries. So much so, Dallas Seminary realized this. That was about maybe 10, 15 years ago, I don't know now, that they saw that there was that they were not doing anything to encourage their students to deal with the backstage. And as a result, students were falling apart, immoral acts in seminary and then as pastors outside of seminary. So they began to include in the program of Dallas Seminary, it doesn't matter what you're there for, you have to be part of these spiritual formation groups which focus on dealing with the backstage. But what I want you to see is that most seminaries don't have this. And so it's being baked in, hurry and busy is being baked into the ministry model. And this focus is on what I accomplish as a leader and not who I am as a lamb. That was the whole thing with the leadership model with Willow Creek. What I am as a leader and never thinking about first who I am as a lamb. And what's its effect, you think, with future pastors? Well, what it's doing for future pastors, this ministry model, it's locking the door to the backstage right from the beginning so that it's not going to be long until these pastors are going to fail in ministry, one way or the other. Donald Capps says this, he says, since our churches have taken on many of the characteristics of bureaucracies, it's not surprising that clergy are often rewarded, not punished, for narcissistic behaviors. When you read that, think acquiring, accomplishing, admiration. Third, busyness is often an unspoken expectation of a job description of a pastor. Second, busyness is baked into a front stage only ministry model. And third, busyness is often a means of pastoral self-medication. Now, what do I mean by that? Every ministry has a cycle that goes through regularly. Sometimes they're called seasons of ministry. And if we just boil them down to two seasons, there are seasons where there are emotional highs, and then there are seasons where there are what? Emotional lows. Emotional highs are times when things are happening. And when things are happening emotionally, there's energy, there's movement, there's anticipation, there's hope. Contrast that with an emotional low where things are what? don't seem to be happening. And when things aren't happening, there is depression, oftentimes there's anxiety, there's a sense of shame, there's a sense of isolation. Now, throughout church history, theologians and church members, church leaders recognized that this was a normal part of ministry. They called the emotional highs times of consolation, and they called the emotional lows times of what? Desolation. Times of consolation were understood to be times when we would experience the goodness of God, that God really is good, and it's more than just something He tells us, but we're experiencing it. Times of desolation were times when faith was to be exercised, because right now things are happening, God doesn't feel good. And so based on my experience of Him, knowing Him good in times of consolation, now I'm to grow and my faith is to be shaped and formed where I'm believing that God is good in spite of the fact He doesn't feel good. And what does it say, guys? It's impossible to please God without faith. So God works in our lives with highs and lows so that we can know He's good and so that we can grow in faith that He is good. Now, recently, we've kind of lost that understanding of the seasons of ministry, the ministry cycle. And so today, when things are happening, we tell ourselves, God is blessing me because I must be doing something right. And during emotional low seasons, we tell ourselves, God must not be blessing me because I must be doing something wrong. And I can get out of this low season if I just do what? Figure out what I'm doing wrong and change it and do what's right. Now, what is a potential problem with a ministry cycle when we view the cycle as evidence of what we're doing in terms of right or wrong, and if the backstage in our own lives is constantly being neglected? In other words, I'm neglecting the backstage, it's a front stage only focus, and things are going bad, so I must be doing something wrong, so I got to work harder, do more, figure out things so I can do what's right in order to get the blessing. What happens when we think like that? Well, with each successive cycle, the lows will become lower and last longer, and the highs will not be as high and will not last as long. And what happens is dangerous cracks begin to appear in our lives. Cracks in our character, cracks in our behavior, cracks in our relationships that we would have never imagined would be possible. And the temptation then will be to escape the discomfort from these lows or these cracks through more busyness and hurry. If I just do more, then maybe it'll change. If I just try harder, then maybe it'll change. If I just do this or that, then faster and further, maybe it will change. And I will have that successful church. Here's my question. What happens when we use busyness to escape the lows and cracks? Does it work? No, it leaves our souls more depleted, more depressed, more desperate, more anxious, more filled with fear and shame, and more isolated. Guys, when our souls are in that condition, which we see from those statistics that the average pastor's soul is, it leaves that pastor, that man, that ministry leader susceptible to illegitimate forms of relief. It's not wrong to want relief, but it's wrong to go to forms of relief that are illegitimate. And what are those? Well, porn, affairs, drugs, alcohol, food, spending, binging, you name it. All the things that cause pastors to have to leave in shame and bring harm to their church. So what can we do to gain access to the backstage and open the door? Well, here's some slowing and quieting practices that you can begin to bring into your own life. On your way home, instead of listening to music or to a podcast or to the news, drive in silence. Try that. It's different. Or something else you might want to do is take a slow, quiet walk, noticing what you see all around you, what you feel, the ground beneath your feet as you walk, the air on your face, what you smell, what you hear. In other words, as a creature in God's creation, recognize creation all around you. I try to do something like this once a month. Take about a 45-minute walk. Something else you can do, sit in silence for 10 minutes and just notice where your mind goes and what your body feels. Don't judge it, don't wonder why, don't try to change it. Just, there goes this thought and this thought. Just notice it. And notice how your body is feeling as you're sitting there. Set your timer for 10 minutes and just do that. Here's a good one. Fast from technology and news for a period of time. Man, with all that's going on today, whether you're listening to conservative or liberal or whatever, all the news is focused on fear and anxiety. And what the news is doing today and what technology does in itself is it triggers our amygdala, that part of our brain that causes us to put out adrenaline, where we get you going, or it begins to impact the primal part of our brain, the reptilian part of our brain, which is all about fight or flight. And when you're constantly triggering those parts of your brain, you know what happens, guys? The inside of you and the outside of you can't slow down. In fact, you might try to slow down, and you slow down, I'm going to just sit here. And you slow down, and what do you feel going on the inside? Your mind is just spinning. Why? Because you've been triggering that part of your brain for so long, it can't shut off. And when you can't shut that part of your brain off, guys, the door to the backstage is locked shut. So we got to begin some practices that begin to slow us down so that we can open the door to the backstage. Regular practice will create a still and quiet soul that will be able to access your backstage. So it begins with slowing down. Some resources: Into the Silent Land by Martin Laird. It's a great book. I've read that book probably 4 or 5 times. It's one of those books where you read just a little portion and just kind of chew on it. It's all about the idea of silence and slowing down. The Sacred Pulse is another good one by April, I think it's Fiat, F-I-E. The I and the E makes it a long E sound, so it's feet. Crafting a Rule of Life. It's a Benedictine practice all about how to arrange your day, your week, your month, so that there's some rhythms and practices that are aimed at slowing you down. Brainwash by Perlmutter. It's a father and son who are neurologists and talk all about how things around us are aimed at stimulating your brains and what we can do practically to stop that. Something I listen to every day, the Daily Liturgy podcast. You can get it on wherever you get your podcast from. And then also Pray As You Go. I listen to that every day as well, in the morning and at night. They have an examine that's done. Pray As You Go is Catholic. And so there, at times, might be a couple things during the course of the year that you might not agree with, but they've got all kinds of good stuff on that app or podcast. So I think with that, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and afterwards we'll come and we'll look at the other two, the self-awareness and surrender. Okay? So 5 minutes. As we get started here, what's one word or two words that going through you right now that would explain what's going on inside of you, how you're feeling? Any? That would sum up what's going on inside you as you're hearing what we're hearing so far? Awareness. Okay. Challenged. Anything else? Hopeful. Okay. Well, I know there's a lot going on, or a lot coming at you in the first half, and we've got a little bit more in the second half, so let's get started. Let's just do a quick review. What we've seen so far is the nature of ministry is two-dimensional. It's what one is in relationship to God, first, in the service of others, second. What we are in relationship to God involves what? The backstage. Peter, do you love me? In the service of others involves the front stage. Peter, feed my sheep. So ministry is two-dimensional. And because it's two-dimensional, it necessitates a back-to-front stage ministry model, not just a front stage model only. A front stage model just focuses on what's going on up front in the stage, what we're doing, what it looks like, accomplishing, and all of that, and it neglects the backstage. But if we're going to focus on a back-to-front stage model of ministry, this will require 3 basic practices that the pastor, the staff, the board, the elders, and even the people who are really seeking to serve Jesus, follow Jesus, and make a difference in the world, 3 basic practices that we need to put into practice, 3 disciplines. First one, we saw as slowing, which is the door to the backstage. Second, self-awareness, sitting in the backstage. And then thirdly, surrender, the work of the backstage. Now, we saw slowing, what that looks like. Now, this time, we're going to begin to pick up with self-awareness, which involves sitting in the backstage, and then we will conclude with surrender, which is the work of the backstage. So let's look at the second one then. Second, the practice of self-awareness, or sitting in your backstage. Once you slow down so that the door can open and you go into the backstage, you then simply begin by sitting there. Before you do anything, you simply sit. Learn to sit in the backstage. Sitting in the backstage is just as important as doing the work of the backstage. You can't do the work of the backstage without first sitting in the backstage. Why? Because sitting makes you aware of the things that need to do work on. If you're not aware, you won't be able to do the work. Because there is work that we have to do in the backstage that is specifically for you, given your background, given your life. Okay? So sitting in the backstage. John Calvin says this: there is no deep knowing of God without a deep knowing of self, and no deep knowing of self without a deep knowing of God. That's like, what is a woman? A woman is a woman. St. Augustine, or Augustine, however you want to pronounce it, says this. He says, Lord, grant that I may know myself so that I might know thee. And then there's Thomas Aquinas, who says, a humble self-knowledge is a surer way to God than a search after deep learning. What are these guys saying? If you want to know God, what? You got to know yourself. And if you want to know yourself, You need to know God. In other words, I got two observations here. An interdependent knowledge of God and self is part of our own theological tradition. Okay? An interdependent knowledge of self is part of our own theological tradition. Calvin says that. Kempis says that. Augustine says that. In other words, if you want to know God, you got to know yourself, and if you want to know yourself, you need to know God. Problem, however, today, second observation, is many pastors, and many American Protestant pastors, focus on the knowledge of God, but neglect knowledge of self. I went through 4 years of seminary at Dallas Seminary, and we got a lot of good stuff on the knowledge of God, but I had one class on psychology from Minirth and Meyer, the knowledge of self, and we didn't really focus on the knowledge of self. We just really focused on all the different personality disorders there were that you might run into in the church, but never really focused on ourselves. And I think that's true of most pastors today. We're really good at our knowledge of God, but we really don't know ourselves. Now, what kind of pastors is this single focus producing? Well, what I would say, it's producing pastors with a theologically informed front stage who minister out of a spiritually unformed or uninformed backstage. Or another way to put it, an empty backstage. Because if you don't know yourself, you can't know God, and if you're operating out of a backstage that doesn't know God, it's going to be pretty empty. What's my point? My point is this: to tend to our souls requires first and foremost that we slow down to enter the backstage, but once we get there, we have to sit in the backstage to gain self-awareness. And there are three things that we need to gain self-awareness of. Many things, but there are three primary things that we need to gain self-awareness of that we often are never talked about. The first one is the truth about our story. The second, our patterns for coping with our story that we've learned over the years. And third, how our story shapes our ministry, or how our ministry feeds our story in negative ways. In other words, there's a lot of things to be aware of in the backstage, and there's a lot of good books on spiritual formation and spiritual awareness that will talk about that. But what I'm saying is this: one of the things that has been really neglected today is this whole idea of our story. And what I am suggesting is that to gain a self-awareness that really is meaningful, that we have to sit in the backstage in order to become aware of our story, what it is, how we've learned to cope over the years with that story in terms of relational style, and how our story shapes and feeds our ministry in good ways and bad ways. Because if we're unaware of it, this will be an elephant in the room that is doing damage to our ministry, to our lives, that we're not even aware of. You say, well, what's your story? What's my story? We hear a lot about that. We talk about that. You know, is it just my testimony? Well, I was this, and now I got saved, and now I'm this. Or is it this happened, this happened, this happened? It's that, but it's much more. Our story, your story, here's a good way to look at it, guys. It's this. Your story is your default operating system for doing life. Your default operating system for doing life. It was shaped and formed in your childhood. It is manifest and lived out in adulthood. And it's not something that we consciously think about as much as we just intuitively relate from. That's our story. For example, your story is expressed daily through automatic relational patterns and responses and reactions to events and people. It's just a knee-jerk reaction to life. Now, that automatic relational patterns is driven emotionally by thousands of stories we daily tell ourselves about how to interpret each moment of the day. For example, Willis, going back to my story with the man with the green barn, Willis looks at me one Sunday morning and he says, you know, you got a pretty good job because you only work on Sunday. Now, he says that, and right away, I can tell myself, well, you know, he thinks I'm lazy, or he thinks I got a pretty good job. You know where I go? He thinks I'm lazy. Now, why do I go there? He thinks I'm lazy. Well, that's because our story is also rooted psychologically in how you learned as a child to avoid and survive the painful disappointments of life that bring about fear and shame. You know what was one of the painful disappointments in life that I dealt with? My dad. My dad was a good man. My dad was a hardworking man. But my dad would always look at me and say, "You are so lazy that you stink." And I don't know why he would say that, because I was the only one that ever helped him out. I was the only one that hauled wood. I was the only one that cut the wood. I was the only one that cut the grass, helped around the house. My brother and sister never did anything. And yet they always got a pass, and I was always the one that, "You're so lazy, you stink." And when your father tells you that all the time, guess what you begin to believe? You're lazy. And so guess what you got to begin to prove? I'm not lazy. So when Willis says, you know, you only work on Sunday mornings, you got a pretty posh job. Right away, what I feel is, he thinks I'm lazy. Why? Because I've come to believe from my father that I am lazy. So what do? I got to deal with that hurt. I got to deal with that shame. I got to deal with that fear of being exposed that I'm lazy by doing what? Doing more and working harder. Now, where does that come from? Well, all that is centered theologically around an inborn idolatrous commitment to self-protection above trust. In other words, instead of trusting God with that shame, instead of trusting God with that fear and that hurt, and say, "God, this really hurts, I don't know what to do with this," what I do is I leave God out. I immediately say, okay, what do I got to do to prove to Willis and to everybody else who probably thinks that as well, that I'm lazy, that I'm not lazy? So I got to have a 40-hour sermon, just preparing for the sermon. A sermon that takes 40 hours to prepare. I got to be at every hospital every time a person's in the hospital. I got to do this, I got to do that. I got to do things that are not my responsibility to show everybody that what? I'm not lazy. And so sooner or later, you become depleted. And you're always afraid that you're going to be exposed. And so physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, you suffer. That's the average pastor today who doesn't understand this story. And when it's centered in this inborn idolatrous commitment that I'm going to protect myself rather than trust God, automatic relational patterns of relating in a lot of different ways. So you got this cycle. How is this all formed? Well, let's look at this. Every man, every woman, every boy, every girl comes into the world asking these things, these questions. Am I seen? Am I soothed? Am I safe? Am I secure? Am I seen? Do people see me? Am I important? Am I wanted? Am I soothed when something happens bad and it hurts? Will somebody pull me close and care for me and tell me it'll be okay? Do I then feel safe in this world because I'm seen and I'm soothed? There's somebody there that will care for me. And if I feel safe, then I will feel secure to go into the world because I'm safe and I'm soothed and I'm seen. Those are 4 questions that you asked when you came into this world. And we're born with these God-given longings that are necessary for human thriving. To be seen, soothed, safe, and secure are all longings that you have to have met, that I have to have met in order to thrive in this world. Now, we grow up in a family where these are to be met, but guess what? They're not met. These were meant to be met perfectly, but because our parents aren't perfect, they're not met perfectly. Some parents maybe do it better than others, but we all have disappointments where we're not seen like we want to be seen, we're not soothed, we don't feel safe, and we don't feel secure. And what we learn is this, that life in a fallen world will painfully disappoint me. And so what is put into our hearts and our minds is the fear of being inadequate, because if I was adequate, they would want me, and the shame of being unwanted. What's wrong with me? That nobody sees me, nobody soothes me, I don't feel safe with somebody, I don't feel secure. What's wrong with me? Now, out of that comes childhood coping strategies, because we can't live with this constant fear and shame. We've got to do something about this. So what we do is I must find a way to make it on my own. My parents aren't there for me like I want them to be. God isn't there for me like I want me to be. So I got to make it on my own. And where this comes from, guys, this comes from the energy of the idolatrous heart. And out of that then comes our adult, self-protective relational patterns. I will use what worked for me as a kid to avoid the fear and shame and manage the disappointment. It hurts too much to deal with this fear and this shame, so if I can just form different patterns of relating and acting in this world, then I can avoid it, I can escape it, I can keep it distant. That then becomes our default operating system. Or what we call what? Our story. How we intuitively relate to God, to people, and to the world around us. It's our knee-jerk reaction to life. Now, I want you to note something. Like Adam and Eve, our story teaches us that to protect ourselves from the disapproving eyes of others, that's what we're afraid of, others, the disgust that we see, what we long for is people's delight. Hey, Mike! Hey, Chris! Instead of, Chris? Mike? We want to see eyes of delight instead of eyes of disgust. And so to protect ourselves from those disapproving eyes of disgust, we create these relational fig leaves. Adam and Eve created fig leaves because of fear and shame. Now, our fig leaves offer a sense of adequacy by covering fear and shame of our own inadequacies, whatever we perceive them to be. And because of their self-protective relational nature, our fig leaves, they're about protecting me, keep us from trusting and loving God and loving people. The great command is to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is what? To love our neighbor as ourselves. What I'm saying is that when we are wearing these fig leaves that protect me from being seen and being rejected, where I can't be hurt, I will never be able to love somebody. I'll never be able to love God as I was made to, because love always requires that we bleed on behalf of another person. Jesus loved and he bled. When I am committed first and foremost to self-protection, I can be nice and I can do a lot of good things for another person up to a certain point, but when it reaches a certain point, then I'm not going to bleed. That's what our fig leaves do. Over time, our relational fig leaves come to form our front stage identity, or what we would maybe call our personality. That's just how I am. That's just the way I am. Well, when you say that, that's just how I am, what you're really saying is, that's my story. Now, there are 3 common front stage identities adopted by pastors based on their story. What are they? Well, first of all, there is the nice pastor who hides his inadequacies from others. The second, there is the decisive pastor who manages others so they can't get close to his inadequacies. Then there is the dogmatic pastor who intimidates others, who pushes people away so they can never get close to see his inadequacies. Now, the nice pastor, to be loved in his home as a kid, he learned how to please people. And as a result, as a pastor, this pastor will be an ingratiating pleaser. Because you see, if he pleases his people, if he pleases his board, if he pleases the people that he is serving, they can never really be angry at him or disappointed at him for anything. Why? Well, he's just such a nice guy. How can I be disappointed in him? How can I be, want anything more from him? He's just a nice guy. A nice guy who's always pleasing will come across as very stable and dependable. He's going to always do what you want, and therefore he's going to be stable and dependable. He's going to be more of a follower than a leader. Oh, what do you think we should do? Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do it. He will be viewed as humble and spiritually mature. Why? Because isn't niceness spiritual maturity? But internally, he will be anxious and afraid. Always afraid that he won't be good enough to please somebody. So he's always reading the room. He has a relationship with people's emotions, not with people. He presents himself as too fragile to require anything. Honey, we can't ask Pastor Jones to do that. He's just, I don't think he could handle that. So let's just ignore that. See, that's where that ingratiating pleaser comes in. Maybe you're a nice pastor. Maybe you are in a church with a nice pastor. It's coming out of his story. Then there's the decisive pastor who manages to be seen in his home. He learned how to achieve. And so this guy will usually come across as a pastor, as a type A leader. He's self-controlled and distant. He services people rather than relates to people. Okay, I can give you 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Okay, let's go. And he's always watching his watch to make sure when time's up. I did my duty. I serviced you, but I didn't relate to you. He's viewed as a mission-oriented go-getter. He's internally blind and empty. And he presents as too busy to bother. We can't bother Pastor Jones. Man, he's just out to save the world. So, he's got all this stuff going. So we can't bother him. Maybe you are a decisive pastor. Then there's the dogmatic pastor who intimidates others. To be safe in his home, he learned to fight. It was survival of the fittest. So as a pastor, he's a confident authoritarian. He's opinionated and competitive. He needs to be right at the cost of relationship. He's viewed as strong but short-fused. He's internally small and full of shame. It looks like he's swinging this broadsword on the outside, but what he feels like on the inside is this: he's got this little penknife he's swinging around. That's how he feels internally. And he presents himself as too unpredictable to approach. I like to talk to Pastor Jones about this, but man, if he doesn't agree with me on this, he might just explode. So let's just leave him alone. What's my point? My point is this: without self-awareness, our self-protective patterns formed in childhood will shape our front stage identity as pastors, as ministry leaders, as men. Why? Because how we learn to survive as kids in our home will always be what we will use to survive as pastors in our church. And what's the result? We become trapped in a pastoral identity. Nice pastor, whatever it might be. That's driven by fears and shame and committed to self-protection over trusting God and loving others. And so we then form a front stage only approach to ministry. If I just make everybody happy, then we'll have a good church. If we just form this mission and accomplish our mission, then we'll have a successful church. If we just get everybody in where they're supposed to be and put everything in order and everybody just listens to what I say, then we'll have a successful church. That's a front stage only approach. And a front stage only approach is a recipe for disaster. So the question is, what happens when we do ministry out of a self-protective identity? We will instinctively relate and minister from an emptiness pursuit pattern. I'm empty, I'm going to use you, rather than a fullness expression pattern. And we will relate and minister by feeding on the sheep rather than feeding the sheep. And we will minister and relate out of our own smaller story as the main character, in which the people that are in my church are the supporting cast, and God is the supporting cast for me, instead of out of God's larger story and me as the support character. And again, this type of setup, guys, it doesn't matter how good you are, it doesn't matter how sincere you are, it's a recipe for disaster. So what can we do? Well, we can learn to spend time sitting in the backstage. How do you do that? Let me just give you some resources here. 40 Weeks is a good book that it really is a process book. It leads you through sitting in the backstage by understanding your story. It's based on the Ignatian exercises, and it's Catholic, but I've used it and a number of guys have used it, and it's very helpful. Another one is the Sacred Enneagram. Another resource, The Gift of Being Yourself. I know a number of you guys have gone through that. That book really helps you understand this false identity that we create and how that's created, and then how to begin to deal with that. Gift of Being Yourself by David Benner. Benner is both a psychologist and a spiritual director. I think he taught at one time at Wheaton. And then there's some self-awareness exercises we have out on the table out here. I think there are 3 different ones that you can pick up that I think would be helpful, again, for understanding your story. Okay? And then we have different opportunities with AHM for pastors. We have the pastors soul care group. We have story weekends, those type of things. So if you want to know more about that, ask one of the guys here that are part of that. So here's my question. If the practice of slowing and stillness is the door to the backstage, which allows me to enter and sit in it, and if sitting in the backstage is about growing in self-awareness so that I might better know God and myself, then is self-awareness the goal of soul care, or is there something more? Put another way, is tending to your soul just the Christian version of navel gazing? And the answer is no. There's a third thing, the practice of surrender, which is the work of the backstage. David Benner, who wrote the book, The Gift of Being Yourself, says this: surrender is foundational to Christian spirituality and is the soil out of which obedience should grow. Christ does not simply want our compliance, he wants our heart. He wants our love, and he offers us his. He invites us to surrender to his love. I like that. So if that's true, then what is it that we are to surrender to his love? And what does it look like to surrender that thing to his love? Well, what I'd like to suggest to you is that surrender looks like spiritual bungee jumping. Okay? Follow me here. This is you. And you are standing on what we're going to call the cliff of safety. And you are looking out over what we're going to call the abyss of death. Okay? Now, what is the cliff of safety? The cliff of safety is busyness and striving. It's the self-protective patterns that we develop through the years. It's our pastoral identities. It's anything that our idolatrous heart uses to avoid fear and shame of inadequacy through relational patterns that we develop. Anything. So if that's the cliff of safety, these idolatrous patterns to avoid fear and shame, what's the abyss of death? Well, the abyss of death is slowing and silence. The abyss of death involves seeing the truth about myself and my story. The abyss of death involves feeling the pain and disappointment, the reality of the fear, the reality of the shame. In other words, anything that triggers fear and shame and threatens to expose my inadequacy. Anything that takes me in that direction, that's going to feel like death. And that's the abyss of death. So here we are on the cliff of safety, standing over the abyss of death. And God in heaven is there, and he's looking at you, and guess what he's saying to you? Jump. And you say, but Lord, I will surely die. And he says, no, I want you to trust me, not yourself, with your fear and shame. And you say, but Lord, whenever I've tried to trust you, I've always ended up exposed, and that doesn't feel good. I will die. And he says, no, I want you to remember one thing. I want you to remember that what's tied around your waist is my bungee cord of love. So that when you jump, you might get scraped up and bloodied a little, but you won't die. Why? Because when you jump, this is what it means to surrender to my love. When you jump, you're jumping as an act of faith. When you jump, you're repenting of your idolatry, all the things that you've trusted as you're standing there on that cliff of safety to avoid the things that feel like death. And when you jump, it's how you are formed spiritually. And so you jump. And know what you discover? You don't die. Again, you might get scraped up and bloodied a bit, but what you learn is the adequacy of inadequacy. That I don't have to be adequate before I jump. I don't have to figure it all out before I jump. God is asking me to jump and to trust Him, not my self-protective styles of relating that keep me safe, that tell everybody that I'm not lazy, that I am a hard worker. And what we learn is that when we are weak, then we are strong. And that life is not found in the cliff of safety. Life is found in the thrill of jumping from it into the abyss of death. You know why? A couple questions. When you're standing on the cliff of safety, does God love you? What do you think? Sure He does. God's love is unconditional. He loves us no matter where we are. But second question, when you're standing there on the cliff of safety, are you experiencing His love? You know when you experience His love, guys? Not when you're standing there, But when you jump and it feels like you're going to die, and all of a sudden before you hit, you feel his love pull tight around your waist, and you swing up over that pit. And guys, that feels like life. Because it is. Life is found in knowing him and experiencing his love, not found in avoiding shame and fear of inadequacy. You say, so how do I jump? Well, here's what you do. You practice things that feel like death. One of the exercises I have out there for you will help you do this. And what I mean by that is practice things that trigger fear and shame and risk exposing inadequacy. If you're a nice pastor, learn to begin to say no to a request and or state your honest opinion without explanation. Say no and then don't tell them why you're not going to do it. Because when you explain why you're not going to do it, what you're asking them is it okay? Is it okay that I don't do it? Am I okay with you? Am I still going to please you? Simply learn to say no to something that's not your responsibility and don't explain it. Other than that's not my responsibility. If you're a decisive pastor, turn off all technology for a day and or spend 30 minutes in unproductive silence. Or if you got kids, just spend time with the kids without your watch. And just learn to enjoy not servicing them, but relating to them. That will be hard to do. It'll feel like death because you got to be productive. If you're a dogmatic pastor, invite a critic to coffee to graciously listen to what they have to say, validate what they have to say without judging what they have to say, without defending yourself or giving your opinion. Just listen, see, understand them. That will feel like death. Or if you're none of those, if you're a married pastor, ask your wife, what is it like to be married to me? And then listen without defending, excusing, or trying to fix it. And if you're afraid that your wife is just going to give you, well, it was a good sermon today. How was my sermon today? It was a good sermon today. And you know that's just the standard answer. Ask your kids. Ask your kids what it's like being their father. And then listen without defending, excusing, or trying to fix it. Larry Crabb says, most of us make it through life by coping, not changing. Change, as our Lord describes it, involves more than managing an outside image. Real change requires taking an inside look that pushes us to expose our ugly determination to manage life on our own apart from God. What's he describing here? He's describing the work of the backstage, isn't he? Exposing self-protective patterns for managing life, surrendering those self-protective patterns to God's love, and then changing those self-protective patterns into trusting patterns. Patterns where I learn to trust God so I can love him and love others as he asks. And all this, guys, is the essence of bungee jumping. So what did we learn today? Well, we learned that the nature of ministry is two-dimensional. Who we are in relationship to God in the service of others. It has a backstage component, it has a front stage component. And as a result, it requires a back to front stage ministry model, which necessitates that we give priority to the tending of our souls. Because it's the tending of our souls, whatever we do with that informs our front stage, good or bad. And there are three kinds of practices that we need to use to attend to our souls. Slowing, which is the door to the backstage, self-awareness, learning to sit in the backstage, and then surrender, work of the backstage. I want to close with one thought, and it's this. In 10 years, how would your life or church be different if you, your staff, or your board, or maybe your whole church, was committed yourselves to a back to front stage ministry model that gave priority to the tending of your souls. In 10 years, what would be different about you? What would be different about how you do ministry? What would be different about your church culture? What would be different about your congregation? I can guarantee you it would be really different. Because what goes on in our backstage, sooner or later, always informs and shapes our front stage. Can I pray? Father, thank you for our time today. I pray that you would take what we have pondered and considered, speak to each of us exactly where we need to be spoken to. I thank you that you love us no matter where we're at. Lord, we really do want to serve you. We want to honor you with all that we are. Otherwise, we would not be here. We would not be in ministry. And so, Lord, we realize we can get stuck. And so, Lord, give us hope and give us direction. As we plan our ways, would you guide our steps? That we would begin to more effectively deal with our backstage. That it might more righteously inform the front stage. For the sake of your church and the glory of your name, and for our joy we pray. Amen.